Okay. All right, I think we're recording now. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Dallas Townsend.
Thank you for such a gracious introduction, Fritz. You didn't read everything I gave you, but anyway.
We only have an hour and a half.
Seriously, gang, I enjoy giving these talks because it's a lot of information that very few of you probably know. I have the advantage of having been born here in 1939. I'd like to know where some of y'all are from. Is anybody from Florida? Okay, there's a few. That's good. Anybody from here? Okay. Well, anyway, what I'm going to present to you, we have 4 major agricultural commodities in Southwest Florida. Cattle, sugar cane, vegetables, and citrus. Not necessarily in that order. But anyway, we'll jump right into it. I'm going to give you a little history of Florida itself that you probably don't know. I do this because there's so many people that are not from Florida. So, Southwest Florida is 5 counties. It's Charlotte, Lee, Collier, Henry, and Glades County. That's what we call Southwest Florida. And it's a very lucrative agricultural area in that it generated over $1.2 million of gross in 2015. And Fritz, I got those numbers from you, and you haven't given me any updated numbers. The total direct impact, indirect and direct, was a little over $2 billion. Those of you that don't know the map, Southwest Florida, I just showed that for the purposes there's and around there. And as you'll note, we do border Lake Okeechobee. The land area of Southwest Florida is utilized pretty heavily in agriculture only in the inland counties. You'll notice that Charlotte County has about 37.77% of the land mass that's used in agriculture. Collier is only 8.9%, and the reason Collier is so low is that over 1 million acres is owned by the federal government for preservation, the Big Cypress Preserve and all of that. And so Glades and Henry County have the greatest share of agricultural land. Lee is about 16.6%. We use about 1.3 million acres of land in Southwest Florida for agricultural purposes. Wrong one. You probably knew Florida was bought from Spain. It was bought for $5 million. You couldn't buy this university for that. But anyway, the United States gave up any claim that it might have had on Texas as a result of the Louisiana Purchase. And they honored that claim. It's just that some fellows that moved out of the United States into the Texas area, they're the ones that didn't necessarily want to go along with Mexico. So anyway, that's the longer story. But in 1822, the United States government, which Florida was a territory, it wasn't a state yet, it didn't become a state until 1845, it divided the state into 2 counties, Escambia and St. Johns County, and the boundary between the two was the Suwannee River. That's a 1922 map showing the 2 counties. And Escambia is basically the town of Howell, and St. Johns County was the peninsula. Now, it didn't take too long before the counties got split out of that, and over the next 105 years, we got split into 67 counties. Beginning the very next year, Monroe County was taken from St. Johns County. Now, Monroe County is the Key West and the south end of the state, and you wonder, how did that county get created before a lot of the northern counties? Key West was a pretty important city back then, down there on the very end of the state. And at that time, Monroe County included all of Dade County, Broward County, most of Palm Beach County, and all of this area here. Then in 1827, they got more divisions, and I thought it was interesting to note you have a county right in here called Mosquito County. It's not really a Chamber of Commerce title, but it was well named. Because if any of you have ever read the book, A Land Remembered by Patrick Smith, he talks about the mosquitoes up that Kissimmee River Valley, and that's where that is. And buddy, they were bad. Lee County was created out of Monroe County in 1887, and then that included present-day Henry and Collier County. And then DeSoto County was created in 1887 as well out of Manatee County, and it included present-day Charlotte, Glades, Hardy, and Highlands County. So as you can see, as time went on by, the big counties got split. This is an 1890 map showing Lee County, the big white spot, and the big counties surrounding it. Charlotte and Glades County were cut out of DeSoto County in 1921, and then Collier and Henry County got cut out of Lee County in 1923. There was only two other counties cut out of the state, and that was in 1925. Gilchrist County and Indian River County were the last two counties that were ever created in this state, and that was in 1925. This map's the 1922 map, and it's on the internet because it's in a brochure that Lee County and the city of Fort Myers published. It was one of those, come to Lee County, it's a wonderful place type brochure, but it showed this map. And at that time, in 1922, Lee County was the largest county east of the Mississippi River, just under 3 million acres. And it's a current map, because you'll notice Charlotte County and Glades County are already shown on the map, and they were only created the previous year. Back to the history. We have, the latest statistic I've got, we got about 178,000 head of cattle in this 5-county area. And are grazing a little over 1 million acres. We've got about 125,000 plus acres of citrus, 65,000 plus acres of vegetables, and the sugar cane varies a little bit, but right now it's 88,900 acres, but that's only in Henry and Glades counties. You have to be close enough to the sugar mills to make that work. And if you was over in Lee County, you'd be too far away from the mills. The transportation costs would eat you alive. So as I mentioned earlier, we have about 1.3 million acres used in agriculture. That does not include timber, nor does it include sod. Cattle was the first major industry in the state of Florida, and you might have guessed already that I'm kind of a cattle-oriented sort of fellow. Ponce de Leon brought the first cattle to Florida in 1521, up there close to Charlotte County. The English brought the English Longhorn in about 1763, and then the Piney Woods Florida cattle were crossbred from those two, and they just kind of run wild and wound up being Florida cracker cattle. The Seminole Indians began to actually commercially raise cattle in the 1700s. Cattleman was in the area though before 1840. In 1840, we shipped about 30,000 head of cattle out of Punta Rassa, which is just right up here at Fort Myers, to Cuba. And that was a real lucrative market because they paid in gold. And during the Third Seminole Indian War, 1855 to 1858, Captain Francis Henry, who Henry County is named for, noticed this looked like pretty good cattle country. And during the Civil War, by the way, this area provided a Confederate army about 50,000 head of cattle. I guess we didn't provide them enough because they lost the war. But anyway, after the Civil War, cattle began to range. I'm sorry, go right ahead.
May I ask you a question? Should you back up
Sure.
a couple of slides before you got to cattle? The one with the sugar. Did you say that the limiting factor of sugar and where it's grown is transportation to the mills and not soil or moisture or anything?
You can grow sugar cane on any soil you got, if you got enough fertilizer.
Okay.
Now, the transportation to the mill is a big cost.
Why is it so difficult to transport?
Huh?
Is it on trucks or trains? Why is it so expensive to transport?
Well, the margin in sugarcane is not real wide to begin with. And so they've determined if you're about 40 miles from the sugar mill, you're at the very edge of profitability. Now, what does change that formula is if you've got rail transportation. Rail transportation is a lot cheaper. But if you've got to truck it with the trucking industry, that makes it an entirely different way. Now, the price must be up a little bit because U.S. Sugar, not U.S. Sugar, A. Dude & Sons has planted sugarcane at LaBelle. And that's about the furthest west I've ever seen sugarcane grown from the Clewiston Mill, which is, it's 30 some odd miles from LaBelle. But that is the limiting factor of where you grow it. And at one time, there were 7 sugar mills out in the Glades. There's only 4 now. All right. I think I covered that. Cattle trade in Florida was with Cuba primarily up until the 1900s. And most of it was either shipped out of Punta Rissa at Fort Myers, which is at the mouth of the Clichet River, or out of Tampa. In the early days, there was no law requiring the cattlemen to fence their pastures. So it was called open range. By the way, we still have some open range areas in the United States. Believe it or not, Maui on the Hawaiian Islands is an open range state. You drive down them roads there, it's your fault if you hit a cow. And that's the way it was here, up until the 40s, late 40s. At any rate, how did you know who belonged to what? What cow belonged to whom? Well, you use marks and brands. And today, a registered firebrand is still the only legal way to prove you own that animal. And so, brands and earmark. Now, we earmark the cattle primarily because what does a cow do when you first drive in the pasture? She looks at you, and she's got her ears out. So they cut notches in the ears in order to give you something to look at, and you can read those notches. This is the 1911-1912 brand registration for Lee County. And that had a little special meaning to me because I knew some of the people, because most of them are dead, on that list. Frank Brown was out of Immokalee. His father was Bill Brown, who had the Indian trading post with the Seminole tribe down there in 1900. J.W. Christian was the man that sold my grandfather, A.B. Townsend, the place he moved to in 1911. And he moved to what is now known as Felton, but back then it was called Eddie. So, now I don't have time to teach you all these earmarks. But when the end of the ear was cut off like that, that's called a crop. That's a split. That's an underslope. This is a crop split with an upper bit. So there was a way, and all the cattlemen knew all these, so if they could look at that animal and it was marked, they could tell you pretty quick whose animal it was. They'd look at the brand to confirm it, but that was how they identified the ownership of the animals. After Henry County was created, each county had to do its own brand registration, so that's the original brand registration for Henry County. And in 1934, my dad registered his stuff along with his brother. So brand registration was very important. Not only did they register the earmarks for cattle, they registered from hogs. Now, why would you do that? Back in that day and time, a wild hog was a cash crop. If you could catch him, put your earmark in his ear, that was your hog, and you had a claim out there, and you could go gather your hogs whenever you needed to. And that disappeared in the late 50s and early 60s. But that was one of the things, and people, you've got to remember, back in the 20s and 30s, times wasn't real profitable. It was pretty tough. So catching wild hogs, marking them, and gathering them up and selling them, and I'll show you some other reasons of why that was done. But that was a cash crop. And so it was important. They had brand inspectors in that day and time. If you moved cattle or sold cattle, you had to get a brand inspector in there to see what animals you were selling, make sure they were yours. And that was one way they tried to catch cattle thieves. Now, this was a bunch of cattle that was driven by Robert Roberts from one pasture to another, and I've got a picture of him later I'll show you, but he was a big cattleman over in Immokalee area. If you had a slaughter plant, you raised animals for slaughter, you had to have a registered list of all of those by the marks and brands. That was to try to reduce your cattle theft, which didn't just occur out west, it occurred everywhere. The cattle industry had some major problems in the past. Fever tick, Texas fever tick got into Florida before 1900. By 1906, it was a serious pest. And in 1923, the federal government implemented a mandatory cattle dipping program. The state and federal government did. The cattle had to be dipped every 14 days, and the state itself constructed over 3,400 dipping vats over the state. Now, it was pretty heavy-handed, because if you didn't dip the cattle yourself, and I'll describe this dipping to you directly, they would send range riders in to dip them for you, and then sell some of your cows to pay for it. Kind of like that Obamacare was.
Is that where the expression "I'll be dipped" came from?
What's that?
The expression "I'll be dipped." Have you ever heard that?
No.
Well, maybe my friend was off base and he was from Louisiana, and every time something happened, he'd say, "I'll be dipped."
Oh yeah, yeah, that's where that came from. I got hearing aids and they're not working terribly great, so if I don't hear you right, I better ask you next time. Yeah, I'll be dipped.
Is this okay with the lights off, or do you prefer them on?
That's fine. It doesn't matter to me one way or the other. Anyway, a dipping vat, and I'll show you one a little bit later. I had a video I was going to show you cattle actually going into one, but it's on my laptop and it's not on me on this one. It was a trench dug in the ground about 6 foot deep, lined with concrete to hold water, and it was usually around 20, maybe as long as 30 feet long. On one end, the cattle went in at was just a drop off. On the other end, they had stairs so that the cattle could climb out, and on the other end, they had what we call a drain pen. You had a pen there. When they come out, they stop them there, let them drain a little bit, and let that drain back into the vat, so they didn't take it all over the place. So anyway, the cattle dipping program didn't get down here until 1932. And they, like I said, they constructed about 130 dipping vats down here. And Carter County had about 17, Charlotte, and you can read the numbers there. A lot of those vats are lost. They don't know where they're at. I know where a bunch of them are, but the state doesn't even know where they're at. They didn't keep records of that. They had a record of the names of them, they just didn't know where they was at. Now, with one at Punta Rassa, by the way, when I gave this program some time ago, a fellow that was involved in developing Sanibel Harbor Resort, he came up to me and said, "You know, we had to dress a dipping vat there, because that's where they shipped the cattle out."
What exactly was in the vat? What kind of chemicals were in the vat?
The first chemical used in the dipping vat was arsenic. And that was used up until the early 40s when DDT come out. And one of the reasons they switched to DDT, besides the fact it was a good one, is that they were beginning to show signs of resistance to arsenic. The problem with arsenic, of course, it stays around a long time because it's an element. It doesn't biodegrade. And if you go around the end of these dipping vats today, you'll find traces of arsenic in the ground close to the vat. It doesn't migrate, it's just there. DDT was next used. Yes.
Can you tell me how deadly DDT is or was? How deadly was that?
There's never been a known case of poisoning in a mammal with DDT.
We used to ride our bikes behind DDT trucks when I was a kid to cool off. And I thought we were all gonna die later on when I got around the DDT wasn't exactly good for you. So I'm still here, that's all I can say.
They've got film of the U.S. Army delousing the natives in the Philippines during World War II with DDT. They just pulled their blouse open and threw the dust down inside the clothes. DDT got a bum rap, and since I've got plenty of time today, I'll give you a little bit of a rebuttal story on the bald eagle program. What happened after, by the way, DDT is still, even today, the best control of mosquitoes that we've ever devised. And when it got eliminated, due to the bald eagle situation, over several million people died in the Asian countries because they didn't have DDT to control the mosquitoes which were giving them malaria.
Well, Fritz, that's some of that conflict with the environmentalists then.
Oh yeah.
About the eagles and all that, and they go back and forth.
Well, what happened on that, after World War II, the demise of the bald eagle was noticed in the Mississippi River Valley. That was a real rich area of bald eagles. And a friend of mine that I trust happened to talk to one of the researchers on that back in 1951. And what they found was that the eggshells were thin, and as a result, they were being cracked and broken and would not, hatch an eagle out. So they began to try to figure out why. They did find DDT in the fat of some bald eagles that they posted. So that theory got, well, maybe the DDT is doing this. But they also had another theory that was going on. After World War II, the Mississippi River Valley was, up until that time, was a sparsely populated and not much industry going on there. But after World War II, the Industrial Revolution up and down the Mississippi River Valley exploded. People moved in by the hundreds of thousands. And the theory was that all this extra human activity was stressing those birds, because we do know that if you stress a chicken, his eggshells are going to be thin. So that was the two theories. But the theory of the DDT got in the newspaper, and they could never get that neutralized. It's kind of like Hitler snubbing Jesse Owens in the 1936 Munich Olympics. Hitler wasn't even there. So anyway, some things happen that are actually true. And as a result, there's consequences. Okay, I didn't intend to give you that little spiel, but I'm glad you asked the question. All right. We thought it was the best thing since sliced bread, because I want you to know, I grew up on the McDaniel Ranch, and until we got DDT in May and June when the rain started and them rustlers, you couldn't see through the screen for the mosquitoes that were wanting to get into us. All right. Before and during the land boom, oops, let me back up a second. In the early 20s, prior to the dipping, due to the open range, we had a lot of large cattlemen put a lot of cattle down in the Big Cypress Swamp to take advantage of the free grazing. And in 1926, the Great Miami Hurricane hit and destroyed 18,000 houses. And that precipitated what we call the Florida land boom bust. So we were actually went into a kind of a depression 3 years before the stock market crash. And then 2 years later, the bad Lake Okeechobee hurricane that drowned about 2,000 people around the lake goes there. That finished off the boom. All right. Anyway, so by 1932, when the dipping got in here, they had all these wild cattle running around. They couldn't gather them, so they hired range riders whose job was either to gather them or kill them. And my father was one of them. In fact, I got a set of horns at the extension office of a steer he killed July the 3rd, 1933. And that steer was coming at him. That's a picture of him, and I don't know where Black Squirrel Lake and Kissimmee Billy Swamp is, but he did. The range riders couldn't gather the wild cattle, so they wound up killing them. And the last one was killed by Frank Brown, who was the father of Percy Brown, one of the range riders in 1934. One of the things you got to remember, all this was going on. We had a depression going on, and food was cheap compared to today, but so was wages. And a lot of people trapped animals for cash. This was some credit books gotten out of an old store in Immokalee that I happened to see being torn down, and vaguely remembered it being a grocery store in the 40s. They had an old book of credit books back there, and I retrieved some that hadn't been destroyed by the rats. What I wanted to bring to your attention was that was Charlie Billy Boy and the Indian at the Roberts General Store in 1940. And look at the prices. Coffee was 18 cents a pound. Now look at my daddy's bill. I happened to find one on him. 1942. Look what happened to the price of coffee. 70 cents a pound. What happened between 1940 and 1942? What happened December the 7th, 1941? World War II started. And so prices went up. Coffee was one of those products that the price really went up. It got over $1 a pound later. This was a credit book that I thought really told an economic picture. Barney Rawlinson, and I knew him, had run up a $57 and some cent grocery bill from January of 1939 to October of 39. You'll notice he bought 2 gallons of gas for 46 cents. The next entry is $7.50 credit for 5 days' work. Now you think about that a little bit. He got paid $1.50 a day working. He had to work nearly a third of a day by 2 gallons of gas. That's why he didn't run around there and fill it up. Trapper. I found the 1935 Hyde book, and you'll notice that these fellows were trapping coons and otters. And you'll notice that prices varied tremendously. If you didn't have a good otter, good skin, you only got a quarter for it. But if you had a good one, it's $1.10. You didn't shoot them. You caught them and banged them on the head or something to preserve that hide. And you see otters brought more money. And you'll notice that Mr. Collier here had a $74.95 payday in 1935. That was 2 months' wages if you was working out there with a cow puncher. Then we had the deer fence. Fever tick was eradicated in the 30s, but the outbreak kept coming on. And it was found in 1937 that the white-tailed deer was a reservoir of the fever tick. He was immune to the fever tick. The fever tick gave you a fever that was really a protozoan disease. And it caused anemia and fever, and if animals survived it, they were never productive after that, and the mortality rate was over 50%. So in 1938, the legislature decided to try to build an electric fence to keep the deer down in the swamp. Now, folks, electric fence is an ambitious project even today. There was no electricity out in them woods back then, so they were using batteries. And this picture here shows you the route of the fence. The yellow line, the red lines are the county boundaries. The red line, it started out in the Glades, went through the South Henry County, jogged down in the Collier County, jogged back up, and then followed the Lee County line and ended in the mangrove swamp over there by Bonita Springs. is over 80 miles long. And that's a picture of one of the old fence posts with the electric insulators still on it. And that picture there is some of the folks that was having to work on that. The guy on the left is Robert Rawlinson. He was a friend of my father's. Next to him was Dewey Brown. Then you got Tommy Guy, and Tommy's the subject of a pretty good little story. Tommy was working that electric fence, trying to keep the grass out of it to keep it from shorting out so that it would convey the electricity. Well, Mose Tyndall was the federal overseer of that thing, and he would ride around and check on everybody and make sure they were doing what they're doing. But he kind of liked to bump you into the electric wire when it was hot. So Tommy had already heard that, and he's in about 6 or 8 inches of water. And so he's got rubber boots on. So when Mose rode up there and the nose of that old horse got right at Tommy's shoulder, Tommy just reached over and grabbed that hot wire and grabbed the bed of that horse. You know what happened, don't you? Electricity went through Tommy into that bed of that horse, and he didn't like it. He reared up backwards. Mose Tyndall had him cussed out before we hit the water on the backside. The deer fence didn't work, couldn't maintain it was the biggest reason. So they decided to eliminate the white-tailed deer. And so they passed a law in 1939, and they, by actual count in Collier and Henry counties, killed nearly 9,000 head of deer in a 2-year period. But they couldn't kill them on the Seminole Indian Reservation because that was federal land, and the Indians wouldn't let them. And I'm going to sit down since my knees are bothering me a little bit. And that got into be a real interesting story of its own. If I can get this to work. Hicks was the Secretary of Interior, and he supported the Seminoles on this. This is a newspaper article in February of 1941 where he said, no, we're going to do a study to possibly see if it's needed. The federal secretary did that, and he got a hold of the Old One Society, and they hired them to do a study on it to see if it was going to work. Roy Comerick was the man they sent down, but you had the Federal Bureau of Animal Health fighting the Department of the Interior for over nearly 2 years. One of them saying you got to kill them, the other one said no, you can't. So anyway, the Cattlemen's Association, which at that time was Everglades Cattlemen's Association, representing Collier, Lee, Henry, and Glades, as well as Western Palm Beach, was trying to get this done. And they had a meeting up there, but they didn't get nowhere with it. Anyway, this argument went on for 2 years. Recently, I found a book on the internet, or my brother actually found it, and I thought the title was kind of interesting. Ticks and Politics in South Florida, the 4th Seminole Indian War, which is really only 3, and the pictures of Roy Comerick. And what had happened, Roy Comerick had went back up to the Tallahassee area, and he died in '84, but he was an avid photographer. And he took tons of photographs down here when he was down here doing that study. And nobody knew who the people in the pictures were, so they published this book about the story on the trying to kill the deer in the Seminole Reservation. And what was really interesting about it, there's a lot of pictures in there. Some of the people I knew, most of them I didn't. The man on the right in that picture is Josie Billy. He was the chief of the Seminole tribe at that time. And the man on the left was Samson Dixie. He was the tribe executioner.
Tribe executioner?
Yep. You did something wrong in the tribe, they took care of you themselves. They didn't bother with the white man law. Now, I don't know if it was a law that would broke a white man law or not, but that was the way it worked way back then. That's Roy Comerick, and you'll notice he's got a deer hide in the back of his office there. My father had been the agent of the Indians there in 1939, and Roy Comerick got him to guide him around that part of the country. So he had a real fancy photography outfit. So I asked him, I said, who was taking all these pictures? He said, son, he had some kind of a tripod and a camera that had a timer on it. We'd set that up and then get on our horses. I thought in 1941 that was pretty advanced. Drinking coffee there in the woods. Anyway, this argument between the two federal bureaus went on, and it finally reached President Roosevelt's office in January of 1942. And his response is, you two fellows solve this and don't bother with me. You know why he said that, don't you? Because in December, World War II had started. And he told them, he said, I think you need to put the whole dang thing off to see if we're going to win this war or not. Anyway, they wound up with an agreement. They killed 42 head of deer. They never found the fever tick on the Seminole Indian deer. And what they finally figured out was that area down there had a lot more highland than in the real deep swamp areas. In the deep swamp areas, the only highlands were small areas. The deer and the cattle themselves bedded down on those areas, whereas in the eastern area, it's a lot more widespread, and the ticks just didn't get on the deer. That's Deer Hunters at Night. That's Robert Rollison driving. Fellow from the old Audubon Society standing up tall, and the guy on the ground on this side is Art Whidden. They're both gone. They're skinning the deer they killed. You'll notice most of them were does in this. They weren't too choosy as to which deer they were killing. That's just a picture of some of the eradication folks. A fella up front on top of the roof is Robert Rollison, and you got the Audubon Society, and then the third guy back coming from the right, it was Mr. Tabb. He was the overseer of the eradication program for the state of Florida. Here's a bunch of the Seminole Seminole Indians, and it's an interesting picture because I happen to know the big guy. His name was Morgan Smith. And you'll notice he's got something in his hand here. Does anybody have a clue as to what that is?
Guess I might.
Well, if you'll notice it's got two handles and it looks like it's got jaws in front of it there. That was a set of Burdizzo emasculators. And they were used to castrate steers because the screwworm was there then, and you didn't dare castrate a steer with your knife back then. You get screwworms in there. So they used that to crush the Seminole vegetable, and he would be a sterile animal. Now sometimes it didn't work. You wound up getting what we call a rig. One that was almost a male. Anyway, that was kind of an interesting photograph there. This is a picture that I had been hunting for years. You see that sack over that horse's head? You know why? This was in 1941. DDT hadn't been brought out yet. That was to protect that horse from horseflies and mosquitoes. And he had, if you look, there's a string all across his rump. He had some underneath the belly as well. You cannot, my dad did the same thing during the war. And you cannot believe how many bad the flies and horseflies and the mosquitoes was at that time. It was finally eradicated for good in 1946, and Robert Roberts, a long-time cattleman, said he was under 3 separate quarantines for 14 years. And that program, while it was successful, put a lot of the small cattlemen out of business. They could not afford to dip cattle every 14 days. That's a picture of Mr. Bob Roberts there at a Mockley Railroad loading pens and some of his cattle in the background. The screwworm was the next problem we had to deal with. And it wasn't in Florida until 1933 when you had the severe drought out in the southwest area, Texas, in that area. And they shipped a lot of cattle from that area into the southeast. And so it came into Georgia in 1933, and by 1934, we had over 1.3 million cases of screwworms in the state of Florida. And it was a major problem for the next 26 years. Flies would lay eggs on the umbilical cord of a newborn calf. Those eggs would hatch, and they ate live flesh right into the belly of the calf. And if you didn't catch that calf and doctor it to kill the worms, chances are you were going to lose it. There's a picture of an animal that actually got injured on top of his shoulder and had a case of screwworms right there. Now, they look like, if you can think of it, a bunch of screws on end down in that hole. Smell, you'll never forget the smell of a case of screwworms. You could drive through some cattle and tell if they had a case of screwworms in there or not at night. You didn't have to see them. Research, though, found out that the female fly mated once, laid her eggs, and died. And so they run some tests trying to see if they could breed a bunch of sterile male flies with a wild female flies, and they would lay sterile eggs. They run several tests, and they were successful. So it began in the fall of 1957, and they had the screwworm in South Florida and most of the southeastern United States eradicated by November of 1959. And I challenge any of you to show me a government program that's successful ever again. All right. The Cattlemen's Association was started on account of the fever tick, and I'll just give you a little history. The Florida Association started in 1934. In the beginning, it was several counties bunching together, kind of like that Everglades Cattlemen's Association. And according to Robert Roberts, the first association was Association River Valley, which was Lee, Collier, Henry, and Glades. And then later on, it got reorganized in the Everglades because it took in western Palm Beach. In 1955, they disbanded that, and each county formed its own association. Collier County formed its own individual association in 1956. Henry County came in 1957. When they disbanded the old Everglades, they had about $600 in the bank. They just donated it to Swords Club Camp up at Lake Placid. I show you this map here. It's a 1960 ownership map of Henry County. And what it does, it shows you two things. We had large landowners. That was the old Circle Bar Cattle Corporation. That's Alico, 130,000 acres. That's Hilliard Brothers here and here. They had nearly 80,000 acres at one time, not all of them. This is the McDaniel Ranch. This is the Indian Reservation. So land ownership in Henry County was dominated by large landowners. But one thing I wanted to show you in this particular map, you see that checkerboard pattern there? That was created back when Diston drained the Everglades. They gave him the alternate sections in a township. He got the odd numbered sections, and he got 100,000 acres of Henry County at that one time. And over time, landowners exchanged land to get blocked up. But that particular area there in 1960 was still checkerboarded. Anyway, fast forward, Florida passed the no fence law, that which meant you had to keep your cattle off the highway. And they gave them a full year to get the cows fenced off the highway, because you just don't just build thousands of miles of fence overnight. We had a major freeze and rain in February the 22nd of 1951, I remember. We had a lot of cattle die of pneumonia and exposure down here. The cattle market crash of 1952 was precipitated because during World War II, Mexico was quarantined with hoof and mouth disease. Price of cattle got up to 40 cents a pound, and big steers were selling for 4 cents a pound, 40 cents a pound, whereas before World War II they were selling for $15 a head. So anyway, that quarantine got lifted in 1952, and it created a horrible cattle market crash. They went down to 10 cents a pound. And then we had a bad winter, 57, 58, and I remember that one well because I was in college then. I woke up to 5 straight mornings of 14 to 15 degrees. And I had never experienced something like that. Now, you folks from up north probably knew that pretty well. Anyway, cattle markets were bound. The cattlemen made huge improvements in breeding and pastures. We had over 300,000 head of cattle in southwest Florida in 1975. But we had a crash in 1975 because we had too many cattle in the United States. We had 135 million head. Now we have about 100 million head. Several freezes in the 80s prompted a massive expansion of the citrus industry, and all this citrus acreage, as well as an expansion of vegetable acreage, come out of the cattle pasture. So the result is, instead of having 300,000 head of cattle, today we got about 178,000 head. This industry here no longer exists as it once was. It began in about 1924, and it was pretty much gone in 1956, so I'll move right on through it. Prior to 1928, there was not much timber harvested because there was no infrastructure down here. You had no roads. Highway 29 did not exist. And so until 28 come along and the railroad got put down there, there was no way to get timber out of the cypress swamp, and that's one of the big items that they were hunting. Atlantic Coastline Railroad and State Road 29 got to Everglades City, and the Tamiami Trail itself was completed in 1928. It only lasted a little over 30 years, and once the original native pine and cypress trees were harvested, the industry just kind of faded away. We still have people cutting mulch out there and scavenging, what I call a scavenging industry. The company did create 2 towns. Standard Lumber Company built one just south of LaBelle called Sears, and there's a road down there named Sears. Standard Lumber Company, you may not know this, was created by Mr. Sears of Sears and Roebuck. Because back then, Sears sold houses, prefab houses. And so he got into the lumber business, and he moved down to Florida because we had lots of virgin timber. And they created a little old town out there called Sears. It actually had a school out there and a commissary and a bunch of houses. That's an aerial photograph from 1940. It had already died and gone because we done that in 1924. But you can just see where the railroad trams went there. And you can also see where houses had been. And the house I grew up in, my dad bought from there after the town went bankrupt. All right, the 1926 hurricane hit that mill the day it opened to run. And I done mentioned the 26 hurricane destroyed about 18,000 houses in Miami. And it precipitated the land boom bust. The demand for lumber died after that. And so anyway, one other problem they ran into, the timber down here grows so slowly. To get it up to log size, the inside of it has become what we call lightered, very dense material with pine tar. And they didn't have equipment to saw through that kind of lumber at that time. It lost money, went out of business. 1928, the town of Sears died. Big Tidewater Cypress, which later became Turner Corporation, owned about 127,000 acres or so down there in the Waxahachie Swamp, Corkscrew, and they built a town down there called Copeland. That town still exists, and run a railroad all the way up through the Fakahatchee Strand on up to where the Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary is today. They began to cut timber in 1944 and shipped to their mill in Perry, Florida. That's the 1953 aerial photograph of Copeland. You'll notice there's a railroad line of cars right there. This is a railroad here, and this is a railroad that went on down to Everglades City. This is Highway 29. And so they had a little town there. Town's still there. This shows you, it's a 1953 aerial of the tram roads that went through the Fakahatchee Swamp. And you can see where the railroad had cut off of branches and stuff here to go out there and get the cypress. That red line that you see there is where Alligator Alley is today. Or I-75. That's the same spot today, showing the alley. During the 12.5 years of harvest, they shipped about 55 trainloads of logs up to Perry every week. They had shipped about 360 million board feet when they got done. But as they reached the last of the virgin timber there at the Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, the environmental groups really put together a move, and so the Lee Tidewater Cypress and the Colliers each donated a section to cover a bunch of that and created the Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. They were gone, all the big timber companies were gone by 1956. And so it takes so many years for pine and cypress to reach marketable size. Nobody's really doing that much anymore. We're, like I said earlier, we're scrapping over for mulch. Vegetable industry, well, that always starts on the coast. There was no infrastructure to get products to the market. So it started, a lot of it started down in around Everglades City. Fellow moved into there in 1873 and was farming along what is now known as the Barren River. And Mr. Storter went down there. And by the way, a descendant of Mr. Storter works in the county extension office in LaBelle. That's Trish Gonzalez. Her maiden name was Storter. Anyway, they shipped tomatoes and cucumbers to Key West, and it got shipped to New York. Prior to 28, they had to be grown near the Clusiatcha River or on the coast. And the Tamiami Trail got completed in 28, as did Highway 29 and the railroad got down there. And so the result was we wound up having some vegetables move along the Tamiami Trail and Highway 29. This is Okeechobee in 1940. And you can see there's a lot of evidence of farming going on there. See all them ditches and stuff there? And of course, there's the people that were living there. You can't see that today. That's all in that big cypress preserve. That was the area of Copeland in 1940 before the town was created. That's the area of Miles City and I-75. Now, there was a little town that had maybe a dozen people at it, and they called it Miles City. Miles City was actually located right there. I'm sorry, right here, not right up there, because the next map's going to show it there. The map's got it incorrect. That's where the interchange is for 29 and I-75. They utilized in that area the Okeechobee Marl prairies. There were very little clearing to be done, and Okeechobee Marl was a good soil for tomatoes because it had a naturally high pH. They had to spray them with some miners, but other than that, it was good. And what really drew people there was warm down there. There was only 3 frosts there between 1930 and 1950. It was very nomadic because of weeds and diseases. You grow a crop there 2 years at the most, and then you moved. So between 1928 and 1955, we farmed about 35,000 acres of Ochoppe Marl prairies in that area. We didn't get on the piney woods much until just shortly before World War II and massively after World War II. And the reason being, piney woods land, pine and palmetto land has a low pH, normally 4.5 or less, and your vegetables won't grow in that environment. University of Florida did a lot of research. They found that put high calcic lime and dolomitic limestone out there will raise the pH, and then you can grow vegetables on it. And that made it a real lucrative place because your elevation was higher. You didn't get flooded out so much.
Why don't vegetables grow with low pH soil?
What was that?
Why don't vegetables grow with low pH soil?
They just don't tolerate it. You've got certain plants that like low pH. Azalea flowers, they want a low pH. But vegetables, most of the vegetables I've ever run into, they like a pH of 6.0 and better. Okay. Anyway, they did the research so we could start farming pine and palmetto woods. We used some of the flatwoods before World War II, but after World War II, they really got used. I wanted to show you this map here because this is South Fort Myers to show you what was going on there. That's Page Field today. You know where that is? Out there on 41. Look at all the farming activity that was going along McGregor Boulevard. That red line is McGregor Boulevard. This is a road that goes over to Sandoval. Now, it did not exist then. I drew it in to show you, give you some concept of where you're at. And this is Cypress Lake Drive here. And of course, this is Colonial where the next bridge goes across. But just look at all the vegetables that were grown along the river here. Why? The river was good transportation to go someplace. And secondly, it was warm there. If you're on the south and east side of the water, when cold air goes across it, it warms it up. That's today. Don't see too many farm fields in there. By the way, that was a 1944 area. Anyway, after World War II, Ochoppe area, you know, it negative just went out. There was some farming going on in there and into the early 50s, but it pretty well faded out. And the reason being, when the pine and palmetto woods around Immokalee got developed for farming, all the packing houses were there, so you saved another 40 miles of transportation. One of the things that occurred during that period of time in the 50s, that Collier County had the first soil survey done. It was the only county in South Florida that had a soil survey. And what they did that, the county extension office got that started in 1951. And it allowed the growers in to pick the best flatwood soils and also, but they still had to deal with weeds and diseases, so they had to move every 2 years. Of course, they'd move. Usually a cattleman would plant some grass in there, and then they'd come back in 4 or 5 years and reform it. Large acreage of flatwood soil left, but the reason they're still left is 3 things. One, most of them are pretty rocky. Number 2, accessible is a problem. And number 3, the shape and size of them just doesn't conduce itself to go in there and spend the money that you'd have to spend to clear up. It costs you $1,000 to $2,000 an acre just to clear a piece of land today. Don Lander in the 1960s, he was the county extension director of Collier County, and I worked under him. He initiated the fumigation process, and today most people use that. And by doing that, you don't have to move so much. Minimal land clearing after 1970, over the years, about 175,000 acres of land were cleared in Collier County and over 250,000 were cleared in Hendry County, but not much since. Beginning in 1995, the vegetable industry began to expand in Collier and Hendry County. It hasn't expanded in Lee County so much because we've got so much development over here. And anyway, a lot of the vegetable growers moved in from the East Coast out of Pompano and Homestead because the land over there got so expensive they put houses on it. And today we have about 65,000 acres of land utilized, 65,000 acres of vegetables. And with double cropping, a lot of times they'll grow one crop in the fall and another crop on that same acre in the spring. So you're only using 35, 40,000 acres. Citrus industry. Prior to the severe freezes of December 28th and February of 1895, it was located up around Marion County. And we had groves down there. Most of them were over in Fort Myers along the Orange River and the Plusiatcha River. The English family in Alva, they moved there in the 1870s and they had groves there. John Christian, one of the fellows that had a brand registered on that thing, he planted 10 acres of grove in Felda where my grandfather bought from him, and it was on that place when he bought it. And then other small groves were planted along the Plusiatcha River. I'm a buff in going into old newspapers, so I found some headlines I thought was kind of interesting. Somebody went to my grandfather's old grove, Townsend Grove, in 1930, and it was still going. And beef culture was profitable in Felda. Felix Taylor was the fellow that got that place named Felda. And what was really interesting, Lake Okeechobee levels are pleasing. They're at 17.8 feet. They almost have cardiac arrest when it gets above 15 or 16 anymore. That grove at, this is a 1940 aerial photograph, 10-acre grove that was there when my grandfather moved. His house was right there. That's the same spot today. Doesn't look the same, does it? I'll give you a landmark. See that house there? There it is. You can see that was a 12-mile slough around there in Buda. Eddie and son owns all that now, and they pretty well drained it and made a citrus grove out of it. But if you'll notice one thing, Mr. Christian knew good land. Look how good that grove looks like right there compared to what's around it. All right, shortly after 1900, down in Carolina, Walter Langford and John Roach bought Deep Lake Hammock and planted 200 acres of marsh seedless grapefruit. Now, folks, 200-acre marsh seedless grapefruit was a huge grove in that day and time. And they had to tote the fruit south 14 miles down to Everglades City to put it on a barge to take it around to Fort Myers and up the river to Alva where the packing houses was, so they could get packed and shipped up north. Believe it or not, that grove was still there in 1940. If you look carefully, you can see the cross hatching in here. Can y'all see that? They even planted this little spot up here. That's Deep Lake itself right there.
Is that Highway 29 coming?
That's Highway 29. It wasn't paved there.
So how deep is Deep Creek Lake?
Huh?
How deep is Deep Creek Lake?
95 feet. We have 3 of those lakes down here south of Plusiatcha River. You got Deep Lake, you got Rock Lake, which is only about 38 feet deep. And you got Tarpon Lake, which nobody's ever heard of, and it's about 90 feet deep. And it's over there near, it's just north of Alligator Alley, about a half a mile, just before you get to the Glades. and I assume they were, subsidence or craters or whatever. I don't know how they got formed. That's Deep Lake today, and you see there's not much of a grove there, but you can see the lake. Anyway, they got tired of using ox carts to haul fruit, so they built a little railroad down there from the Deep Lake down to Everglades City. And they didn't have a big old steam engine, so you know what they used to pull the carts with? They got a Model T, put rims on it to ride on the rails, and they pulled the carts for the Model T truck. And later on, when the Atlantic coastline got down in 28, that was incorporated into their system, but it had to be improved significantly. Yes, brought that map back to you because it showed the Deep Lake Railroad. That red line was the Deep Lake Railroad, because the railroad was down to Mockley, but it hadn't got down there yet. Charles Garner planted a grove in Immokalee in 1914. Part of that grove is still there, part of the Roberts Ranch site. That's a 1940 area of Immokalee, and you'll note if you know Immokalee at all, this 29 curves through Immokalee right about here now. That wasn't there then. And of course the airport in Immokalee wasn't there either. Of course that was built during World War II. So you can see the grove right in here. And that's what's left of it, because it's part of the museum over there today. Up to this time, the groves were all planted mostly on hammock lands, upland hammock lands. But in the late 50s, they did some research to show that citrus would could be grown on the flatlands. And so there were a few small groves in the flatwoods near Immokalee there. And in 1962 freeze accelerated that expansion. The Collier Company and Turner Corporation both planted about 1,000 acres of citrus together in the early 60s there. And then, in the late 60s. Then you had a major freeze in 1977. Then you had them again in 81, 83, 85, and 89. And that really exploded the citrus industry down here, because over 165,000 acres of citrus were wiped out in Central Florida. The citrus industry has really expanded over time, but it's kind of stabilized. You'll notice back in 1960, there wasn't much citrus in Collier and Henry. I don't have the data for Lee County, but as time went on, Collier peaked out in about 35,000 acres. Henry peaked out at about 99,000. We're down now at about 64,000, 29,000. The canker disease and citrus greening disease have been the major cause of all of that. Sugar cane. Sugar cane is an interesting crop because it's only over in Glades and Hendry County, but it's something that we all ought to know a little bit about. It's the only commodity in Southwest Florida that has a government's subsidized program. Now that program is not subsidized like what you think of in the grain industry out in the West and Midwest and whatever. It's more of an insurance policy. And the only time it really costs the government money is if the government has to take the sugar. And that's only happened twice in the last 35 years. They have to budget the money for it, but as you know, government, when money is left over someplace, it gets used somewhere else. Okay, the first production of cane in Florida was in 1767 and 1776 at New Smyrna Colony. That was up here in New Smyrna Beach. And when that colony disappeared, that disappeared. Then the next one was in Manatee County, and it was before the Civil War, and it got pretty well destroyed during the Civil War. There were 13 attempts to establish an industry in Florida before, and none of them were successful until the 1920s. And It's probably the most politically manipulated crop in the entire world. And I'll get into that in just a second. The political history of sugar in the United States began with an import tariff on sugar in 1789. And you got to remember, the federal government back then, its primary source of revenue was tariffs. Didn't have income tax or corporate taxes. So they charged anybody bringing sugar in the United States 2 1/4 cents a pound. And that went on from 1789 to 1890, a little over 100 years. Well, it had the effect of protecting the domestic sugar growers, which are mostly in Louisiana, and the sugar beet states. We didn't have a sugar industry here at that time. In 1890, they repealed the tariff because they were doing good shape money-wise, and they paid the growers a 2 1/2 cent bounty just to protect them. And the repeal of the tariff put the Cuban industry in business. However, they were much closer, could sell the sugar much cheaper, and so it just about devastated the Hawaiian sugar industry, which at that time was a huge industry. So it got reinstated, and between 1894 and 1934, sugar industry went through a lot of tumultuous times. It went through good times and bad times, and then you had World War I come in during that period of time, and there was a world shortage of sugar during that period of time, and it caused all the sugar producing countries to make sure that they could meet their own needs before anybody else could bring sugar to them. And what that did, countries like Cuba, which relied on exports, had no place to sell the sugar. So as a result, in 1932, the world price for sugar was 1 cent a pound, and in the United States it was 3 cents a pound. As a result, Congress passed the Jones-Costigan Sugar Act of 1934. And the intent was to maintain a sugar industry in the United States, beet growers as well as sugarcane growers, but of a limited size, because sugarcane was viewed as a tremendous pond for the export-import business. If we could let people sell sugar to us, they would buy other products from us. That's how all this international trade thing works. And as you see on TV anymore, we buy a lot more than we sell to others. But anyway, that's what it was designed to do. And during the time, the first major sugarcane growing in Southwest Florida started in the Clewiston area in 1921, Southern Sugar Company. Well, they went broke later, but they built a mill first. And when they went broke, it got reorganized as the United States Sugar Corporation in 1931. Domestic growers had quotas, and designated countries had import quotas. In other words, if you were from Cuba, and you had a certain amount of sugar you could send to the U.S. market. And U.S. at that time only produced 30% of the sugar we consumed. World War II was another event. Now, I didn't remember World War I, but I do remember World War II. Sugar was rationed, and you didn't buy sugar if you didn't have a ration ticket. You had to go to the government to get it. And so we hunted up wild beehives, try to get something to sweeten our tea with once in a while. Anyway, the quotas were suspended during the war, but it didn't matter. The world sugar industry was just devastated due to the World War, and there was no sugar. As a result of this, the vast majority of the countries in the world that produce sugar wanted to protect their industry and make sure they had an industry. 1948 Sugar Act was passed, and at that time the domestic producers in the United States was allowed to produce 55% of our sugar. 45% was imported from the other countries that had quotas. Cuba had the biggest part of that quota. They supplied 35 to 40% of our total consumption needs at that time. However, in 1959, Castro took over Cuba, and he announced they were no longer going to sell sugar to the United States. I have that in written form. And so the result was exports to the United States were terminated in 1960. At that time, Florida had 62,000 acres of sugarcane. Domestic producers were allowed to increase production somewhat, but most of the Cuban import quota was diverted to other countries. The federal government relaxed the quota system in 1962 and to make sure we had plenty of domestic supply of sugar. And by 1965, we had 250,000 acres of sugarcane being produced in the Everglades agricultural area. The Everglades Sugarcane Growers Co-op was organized during this period of time. In 1964, the United States entered into an international pricing agreement, which was pretty good. And it worked good because there was a surplus of sugar throughout the whole world between 1964 and 1970. However, this agreement expired in 1973 and was not renewed. So beginning in 1970-71, the world production of sugar had not kept up with world consumption. We were eating more of it. As a result, world reserves decreased through the 1973-74 season, and the price of raw sugar in this period of time was about 10 to 15 cents a pound for raw sugar. The reduced world reserves, the OPEC oil embargo, and I don't think any of y'all old enough to remember that, 73 and 74, large weather crop shortages in all of the countries that produce sugar caused an extreme low reserve of sugar and caused an exploding sugar price. The price of sugar rose from 15 cents in June of 74 to over 60 cents in 74. It settled back down around 45 cents and stayed that way through 1975. The retail sugar at the grocery store went up to $5 for a 5-pound sack of sugar. You talking about some housewives that got approved. That was a shock to them. The housewives, the candy manufacturers, other users of sugar were screaming. Cold drinks and candy bars went from 10 cents to 25 cents. Government encouraged domestic producers to expand their production, and since producers were enjoying record profits, they did not renew the Sugar Act. Domestic sugar production was no longer controlled with quotas, and there were no import quotas. As a result, sugarcane production was rapidly expanded, and the acreage in the EAA, Everglades Ag Area, expanded to over 350,000 acres. However, the world production of sugar also expanded. The high prices of sugar was enjoyed through 75, but when that expanded world surplus of sugar got to the market in 1976, it dropped to 8 cents a pound. And by end of 77, the entire sugar industry of the United States, which was the sugar beet states as well as the sugarcane states, was about to go completely bankrupt. So, and of course we was enjoying under Carter's regime back then high inflation rates and high other costs. The Glaze County Sugarcane Corps at Moorhaven did go bankrupt. As a result, Congress passed another law in 78 to try to resolve this crisis. It's quite interesting to note that while the prices of Cokes and candy bars jumped up when the price of sugar did, when the sugar price crashed, then prices didn't come down with it. They stayed right up there. All right, we've operated under a sugar program ever since 1978 due to those issues there. And sugarcane acreage in the Everglades Ag Area, and we have recently in the last 20 years began to grow a lot of sugarcane on the sandlands of Henry and Glaze County. And we have about 425,000 acres of sugarcane in the state of Florida at present, and that's been that level for several years now. The U.S. production of sugar in 2015-16, 10 states produced sugar beets on 1,144,000 plus acres, and they produce about 56.6% of the sugar we have. 4 states produce sugarcane and have a total of 892,000 acres. The 4 states is Florida, Louisiana, Texas, and Hawaii. But Hawaii is no longer producing sugar. They quit after the 2016 year. We produce about 72.3% of the sugar we consume. The remaining 27.7% is imported, and 45.9% of the imported sugar comes from Mexico. That, folks, is an abbreviated history of the 4 commodities. I hope you was able to understand what I said. It has a rich history, and in this industry, it was actually made the place inhabitable, and I got a little story about that. Back in the 70s, we had a fella come in the extension office, and he was hunting brochures for growing plants around his house, and he finally got around to saying, you know, you folks have made this place habitable since I was here last. Well, that begged the question, well, when was you here last? He had been stationed at Buckingham Army Base, which is in Lee County, right just up the road a ways here. And he said, when I shipped out for the Normandy invasion in 1944, I swore on my mother's grave I wasn't never coming back to this flooded, snake and mosquito-infested hellhole. You had to live here to understand what he was talking about. It's the only area in the country that we can grow products that we grow during the wintertime. And we do have a lot of things, issues to deal with: water supply, water quality, wildlife habitat issues, government regulations that are imposed a lot of times without scientific basis, and the free trade agreements have pretty well wiped out the small vegetable growers around here. These issues are so onerous that the day may come when we won't be, we will export our food production to other countries. And since less than 1% of the food we import is inspected by us, our food safety is no longer under our control, and we no longer be self-sufficient. That's what made this country such a strong country. We were self-sufficient in food production. That's it, folks. I'll answer any questions you may have. And I don't know how long I took, so I wasn't watching.
Okay. Questions?
So, one of the reasons I'm here is because I'm a food guy, right? I'm a restaurant, commercial food service guy.
Good.
And the trend, of course, they say